So let's start with the big man himself, Brett Yormark, who we commented, Nathan and I were talking before we started to record, that usually gives us something to go on because he is, I think he's done an exceptional job for what he has to deal with and all the challenges that are unlike anything that his predecessors had to deal with in any of these conferences. But he's got his work cut out for him, but he is still one of the big four, and he's got a deep football league, and he certainly expressed that today. So your thoughts about Brett Yormark, what you heard him say today, and we'll get into this playoff format discussion as well.
Right. So I think I've been a fan of Brett Yormark since he's taken over the reins at the Big 12. I think he's done a good job of raising the profile of the conference. Obviously, BYU being in the conference, I'm kind of selfish when we look at these different things and how they matter out in the world. And he's never shy about giving quotes. So the quotes that really stood out to me, and I'll read a couple of them, and then we can talk about them in detail as you want to. But the first one was specifically about the 5-11 playoff. He has two quotes here. He says, "I'm doubling down today on the 5-11 rather than the 4-4-XX, whatever playoff format you might get." He expects that Jim Phillips at ACC Media Days will come out and say the exact same thing he is. So it's obvious now that in the past we assumed they were on the same page. Now he's admitting that they're actually doing that. They're working together, trying to keep that signaling down. And that, well, there's two pieces. First off, he says the 5-11 is best for the Big 12 because we don't want to be given anything. We want to go out and earn our access to the CFP. The second half of this, and this is the thing that I found was quite interesting, is he says the memorandum of understanding, the MOU they signed for the CFP last year, doesn't necessarily grant sole and exclusive power to the Big Ten and the SEC. The reason that matters is because that playoff format, everybody's assumed that they're going to be driving the bus. So out of those two things, just one, doubling down on the 5-11, and two, saying, hey, they don't necessarily get everything they want just because they were given the power a year and a half ago, I found very interesting because we've never heard that before. That quote does not necessarily grant sole and exclusive power. Is remarkable. That if we were to been given that information a year and a half ago, the messaging, at least from me and my team, would have been different, right? We would have had an understanding that maybe there was more we could have done to earn that respect. And so, and that then leads into the reason that he's doubling down on 5-11, because he's saying it might not go all the way of the Big Ten and the SEC.
So I think with a situation like this, Nathan, when there's a decision to be made and it's a public decision, that there are two ways to look at it. One, the leader, Brett Yormark in this case, has to look at it to say just the nuts and bolts, regardless of anybody's perception of this, their criticism, what is going to benefit the Big 12 more? Is it going to be the 5-11 or is it going to be this 4-4-2-2-1-3?
Right.
And then the next thing he is to look at is, regardless of what the nuts and bolts say about most likely what's going to help us, what is the perception of our push, of our preference? This is what I think, is that if you say we're the Big 12 and we're going to accept this 4-4-2-2 model, that you're basically saying we're an inferior league to the SEC and the Big 10. We are half of what they are. That's what you're telling the masses if you accept the 4-4-2-2 model. So I don't think he wants to do that. But from a logistical standpoint of what's likely to happen, obviously, if you take the two spots, automatic, you get two spots in the playoff.
Yeah.
If you take the 5-11, I got to think that the Big 12's most likely going to land with two teams in a 16-team field most of the time. But the likelihood of the Big 12 getting that third team, I'd really have to weigh that out. I don't think it's very likely. So they're probably landing in the same spot regardless, although with the 4-4-2-2, you're guaranteeing the second team, which they would not. I'm trying to think. I think by running the system last year, BYU would have been elevated into a 16th position. They were number
Well,
17
they were 17,
before
yeah.
postseason play if there was a 4-4-2-2. But otherwise, they would have been left out, and
That's
it would
right.
have just been Arizona State.
Yeah, so this is the dichotomy, and it's absolutely black and white to Big 12 land. You either support it or you don't. The way I look at it is like this. I would rather have the guaranteed spot, and I don't care what your perception of me is, because once I get in the tournament, I'll show you how good I am. We'll win some games, right? I'm being more pragmatic and saying I just want that second team, no matter what, to be in the race so that you can compete. I don't necessarily believe every year the Big 12 is going to get a second team, let alone a third team every year. So the argument, and he said this himself, Brett Yormark said this himself, he doesn't want anybody to look at the conference like they're less than because they codify the two that they would get every year. I look at it the reverse. How bad does the Big 12 conference look if that every year, or say 2 out of 6 years, are the only 2 that you get more than one team in? What does that make the Big 12 conference look like? It makes it look even worse, in my opinion. So I'd rather take the upfront hit and say, let's get as many teams in there as we can, guaranteed, and then have them get in there and win some games, than the reverse of, yeah, you might earn a second team, but how many people see a third team coming from the Big 12 in the next 5-6 years? It's pretty hard for me to see that. So I'm on the other side of the fence. I have since this was first announced. Everybody knows I'm on record to say I think the 4-4. I would prefer a 3-3-3-3 or a 4-4-3-3. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could be better, but at a bare minimum, I like the 4-4-2-2 because it does give you that second team. So we will find out. Time will tell which would have been the better strategy. We won't know this year. But we might know in 3 years how that bet has turned out. So we'll have to find out. All I want to tell people is that I'm on record saying that I don't necessarily think this is the greatest thing. And the perception battle, that's what he keeps looking back at. We don't want to be perceived as a less than conference, half of what the Big Ten and the SEC are, just out the gate. I say you might end up there anyway if you only qualify one team in a majority of seasons. So we'll have to see.
And it's a great point that you make when you emphasize the word guaranteed 2 spots, that it's not that you're locked into 2 spots, it's that
Right.
that's a minimum. So there
Yes.
is a possibility. It's not a huge possibility, but in the right situation, if you really have a dominant team that makes it in, and then you got a couple 10-2s hanging around that just make that cut, and maybe you get 3 in,
Right.
because that is just a minimum.
Yes. I don't know. We'll see. Last year, like you said, BYU was the 17th team. If people don't think that meant something, they don't know what they're talking about, because it was left out at 17, knowing that we would have this revisionist history that would look back and say, well, see, BYU, the Big 12 wouldn't even have had a second team in. So what are we even talking about trying to give them a second or a third spot? Because look, in the one year they had a two-team, a two-loss team that really should have been in the thing, strength of schedule and everything else. They're still not in there, and that's not a perception loss. I just don't, I look at it like this. If I'm BYU, I want to get into the tournament. Then once we're in the tournament, let's go and win some games. But you're not going to win. You can't win games that never occurred because you don't make the tournament.
The thing we can't account for, Nathan, is the integrity of the committee. Now,
Right.
I will say this, that in 11 years of a college football playoff, all of them with a 14 playoff, except, of course, last year, I don't like the committee. I don't like that there's a committee, but I have to admit, I don't have any huge issues with their selections. I think there's a couple that could be questioned, but if they would have selected that team instead of that team, then I would just question it the other way. So
Right.
they haven't made any egregious errors at all. And if anything, we have to pat them on the back from the Big 12 and ACC perspective last year, in that they, when faced with SMU in particular, they went that route instead of dropping down a game or a loss to 3 losses ushering in the likes of South Carolina, Alabama, or Ole Miss.
Right.
So they made what I thought was the proper decision there. But the thing that's funny is that in this 511 process, they have the power, which they've had the power all along.
Right.
But if you box them into this 4422 business and then you get these automatic spots, that limits their authority. So we've trusted them this far, and they've basically delivered reasonable selections. So I see no reason in from just not a Big 12 perspective, but just a national perspective of doing what should be fair if we trust their judgment.
Right.
Then it would be the 5+11 deal.
I could advocate for 511 just as easily. I love arguing the opposite points, and a lot of cases I'll take an opposite view just to be the opposite view. In this case, I don't think it is 6 and 1 half does the other, though. I think we're going to end up finding out where, for one thing, we're still only 12. So right now it's 5+7. And if you get two more teams in, that gives you opens more opportunity, right? Four more teams in, and you go to 11 at large. Great. I'm all happy and I'm satisfied with that. I just don't think in the long run we're going to look back and we're going to see an empowered Big 12 that every year is fighting for a third, let alone a second spot. Because if in your head right now, all you're concerned about is what the PR hit looks like and the fact that you want to get a second team in, then go with the guaranteed spot. What's the purpose of having to fight for that when you can just get it out the gate versus you run the risk every year of not getting a second team in, let alone a third. What does the world look on that in 2030, 31? How does it look at the Big 12 then?